So when I think of agrivoltaics from a farmer's perspective, I think there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is the farmer who wants to keep farming, but maybe doesn't want to be caught in the incredibly challenging game of commodity pricing. I have one of our farmers who's looking to work with us, who's been a corn and soy farmer for 50 years. And his struggle right now, he's saying, hey, I'm getting $4 a bushel on corn, which is the same price I got in 1970, but my input costs have gone up 10x.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm really excited to have Peter Schmitt. He's the Director of Project Development at US Solar. And I'm excited to talk about a topic that we've spoke about previously on the podcast, agrivoltaics. And Peter's really focused on, obviously, agrivoltaics, community solar, and CNI development. Thank you, Peter, for being on the podcast. It would be great if you could tell us about US Solar.
Yeah, happy to do so. Thanks, Benoy. So US Solar is just over 10 years old now. We just celebrate our 10th anniversary. We are headquartered out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, but we have offices kind of all over the country at this point. We are primarily a community solar developer, financier, and long-term owner-operator. We do have some other business units now, including a more transmission interconnected utility scale side, as well as a CNI side. But the bread and butter of what we do is community solar. We were originally formed in response to the creation of Minnesota's community solar legislation back in 2014, 2015. And we're now, again, operating in 10 or 12 states. Our primary markets are Minnesota, Illinois, Colorado, New Mexico. But again, we keep expanding to do justice to our US Solar name. I've been with the company for about 8 years. So I started when we were very small and did everything from landowner negotiation and interconnection through permitting and operations handoffs. But my role now is agrivoltaics evangelist, as well as working on our transmission interconnected team.
That's amazing. And that's how I heard about US Solar, was when the Minnesota Community Solar Program got approved. Obviously US Solar did a lot of the development and owning of projects in Minnesota, and that's great to hear. So congratulations on 10 years in the solar industry, which I'm sure for you being there for 8 years, it's almost like dog years, right? When we did 30 years to see Minnesota, right, as a new market when you came, and now it's very established. You guys have expanded to other states, and agrivoltaics, even though, it's been around for a few years, it's still very early in the development of agrivoltaics projects. It would be great, actually, if you could tell our audience who's not familiar, what is agrivoltaics?
Yeah, so agrivoltaics, it's morphing a little bit as we get more developed in the industry, but generally is the concept of combining agricultural activities with PV solar production. So this isn't necessarily like having solar on the roof of a milking barn. That's still great. That's still excellent for the farm, but this is more having, either pollinator habitat or grazing or crop production, beekeeping underneath and around the solar facility itself. We've started seeing in the conversation over the last couple of years, maybe a split between ecovoltaics, maybe pollinator services side, and agrivoltaics being grazing and crop production. But overall, I would say most folks establish agrivoltaics as anything being under that bucket of pollinator services, beekeeping, grazing, or crop production.
That makes sense. And I appreciate you simplifying the definition for agrivoltaics, because I feel like there's really no truly accepted definition. And then when I talk to different people, everyone has a different opinion of what it means. So I really appreciate you summarizing that into those 3 or 4 different components.
Yeah, that's actually a great point for something we're working on at US Solar right now, is that we want to be speaking that same language with everybody, and having a unified definition is something that's really a good starting point. So I know Colorado has passed an agrivoltaics definition bill. We're actually trying to help spearhead that here in Minnesota, just again to make sure that, when farmers, when legislators, and when solar developers are talking about agrivoltaics, there's kind of that standard language. And we're hoping to see something like that come at the federal level eventually, but it's an uphill battle always. But being able to speak the same language always helps people, whether it's negotiating with farmers or, talking in permitting meetings.
For sure, it definitely is. And I had an appreciation for this. I know, Peter, we were talking about this. There's been the first 2 agrivoltaic conferences that was organized outside Chicago in Rosemont. Is it right? Rosemont, Illinois. Dan French, who we've had on the podcast. And it was interesting because he mentioned a couple of times, as an industry, we have to come up with a uniform definition And I appreciate you doing that just because I think it creates confusion too in the same language, especially when you're educating farmers, right? As well, and something new to them that, they might have not heard in the past.
Absolutely. And you've seen it play out in some of the state policy creations as well. As Illinois has turned into this community solar booming state, one of the debates they had and neighbor Indiana also had was, what percentage of a project has to be in agrivoltaic activities to be considered an agrivoltaic project. There was part of the industry that was arguing, okay, maybe we'll just call it 10% and we'll throw some seeds in the corner and it'll be an agrivoltaic project. But yeah, I think it's better to have this unifying standard to say, actually, no, the whole site or whatever, you can call a portion of the site an agrivoltaic project and a portion not. But the fact that we're still kind of talking past each other on what should constitute this is, again, indicative that there's still a little bit of work to do here.
Definitely, for sure. And I think it would be great too if you could, obviously we have a wide audience who listens to it. Like, why would farmers want to look into agrivoltaics?
Yeah. So when I think of agrivoltaics from a farmer's perspective, I think there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is the farmer who wants to keep farming, but maybe doesn't want to be caught in the incredibly challenging game of commodity pricing. I have one of our farmers who's looking to work with us, who's been a corn and soy farmer for 50 years. And his struggle right now is he's saying, hey, I'm getting $4 a bushel on corn, which is the same price I got in 1970, but my input costs have gone up 10x. I can't make this work. I don't want to have all of my risk be put in this commodity market where, we came forth and said, hey, why don't you let us put a solar project here? You can keep farming underneath it. You'll have a little bit of disruption during construction. We're not trying to hide that. And it'll be a little bit of a different kind of agriculture. Maybe you're not going to be driving a combine or a thresher through our solar facility, but you can still be a farmer. You can still be growing food, growing crops, grazing animals underneath while diversifying your income. So you're not just in the commodity space. You've got, different crops that you can bring to market on your own. Layering on top of that, we can bring in pretty substantial lease payments as a sort of annuity on top of it to make sure you have at least a baseline as a farmer. So that's kind of one side from the landowner farmer perspective. The other side we're seeing, and something about our Bigger River Farms project, I know we'll talk a little bit more about in this pod, is we've got a lot of farmers who are looking for access to land. They're new to farming, new to agriculture for one reason or another, and they maybe don't have the generations of farming family to have land to farm on. And breaking into that space is really challenging, especially if you're trying to get something more than a year-to-year lease, which if you only have 1 year guaranteed for your farming operation, it's really hard to invest in soil quality or invest in equipment. But with agrivoltaics, we can go to that farmer and say, hey, you can come farm on our site for 10, 15, 20 years guaranteed, for free. And in a lot of cases, it helps us as well. Now that new farmer has access to land that they can be sure about and they can invest in and they can create that livelihood, that business for themselves moving forward. So I look at it from both of those perspectives is, someone either wants to keep farming or wants to support agriculture on their land, or from the other side, just providing more opportunities for more farmers so we can continue to kind of grow our agricultural community, which is important considering we've been overall in kind of a phase of consolidation and agricultural decline since the 80s, not in production, but in just the number of people in the agricultural industry.
Yeah, that's really great and really helpful to explain, Peter. And it's interesting because you were talking about the Big River Farms and it being new farmers. Can you talk about the innovative partnership or how you're innovating land use with agrivoltaics? I know you're talking about farmland access, Beowulf as well.
Yeah, happy to do so. I love talking about Big River Farms. So Big River Farms is a program of the Food Group, which is a nonprofit here in Minnesota. They focus on a variety of hunger issues. So if you saw anything in the news about, free school lunches in Minnesota, that was something that the Food Group was part of. They also run a series of food shelves and hunger abatement programs. They collect leftover food from farmers markets to get to food shelves. Do a lot of really good things on that front. Big River Farms is their farming part of their program where they have a farm in Marina and St. Croix, Minnesota, the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin along the St. Croix River. And they work with what they call emerging farmers, which is these are BIPOC farmers or underrepresented groups. Generally, there are not many women in the agricultural sector, so they also fall into this emerging umbrella. And they teach them how to farm. They do this by providing small plots of land, anywhere between a half acre and an acre, and teach them what the growing conditions are like in Minnesota, how to connect to markets in Minnesota, what the paperwork looks like, and kind of generally are providing that technical assistance to help them get ready to go into their own farming operation with the goal that after a couple of years, they kind of go out into the world and can start their own farms. And they received a grant through the Mortensen Family Foundation to do a pilot project for doing that kind of agriculture on solar arrays. And their initial partners they found were Reneu Energy. Rob Davis was there at the time and is a big champion of agrivoltaics. He's now with Emirates. And then US Solar also got stepped to the plate. We've known Rob for a long time. We've been active in agrivoltaics in the various spaces here in Minnesota since our founding. So we were kind of a well-known entity, and somewhat randomly, I knew the farming manager at Big River Farms because my wife and I built a straw bale house and we had leftover straw, which we donated to her farm. And this kind of all came together. So Big River Farms then placed farmers on our site. So on our Big Lake site, so we have Big River Farms on the Big Lake site in Sherburne County, Minnesota, which is just northwest of Minneapolis. It's a 1 megawatt community solar array. It's actually the first project I ever developed for US Solar back in 2017. It's been in prairie habitat since then, but we undid some of the prairie in a couple of rows to allow farmers to come in and grow crops there. In addition to that, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory also is placing research farmers there to see what grows best underneath solar arrays. Some crops are better, some are do worse. And a nice thing about our Big Lake site is that we own it and we have extra acreage outside of our solar project fence. So we had an immediate spot for a control plot. So we have our control, we have our research farming, and then we have two farmers in this first year from Big River Farms. They're twin brothers, Stephen and Simon. They're from Kenya. They were farmers there. Turns out the growing conditions in Kenya and Minnesota, not super similar. So they've been growing on our site. And then going into 2025, we're now going to increase the number of farmers again. So we're going to have 6 farmers from Big River Farms on our site, in addition to the research farming. We're planning to continue to grow that relationship. We were lucky enough to be able to donate money so they could put in a new well on the site to help with the agricultural operations. But the nice thing here is, again, so Big River Farms was exactly the example I was talking about, where a lot of their farmers were having the problem where they graduated from the program, they really wanted to get going, and they didn't have access to land. And now we can provide that for them, on these long contracts. And the best part of it is, though Big River Farms' home farm is in Marine on St. Croix, not all of their farmers are from there. They were commuting to that location from around the state. And US Solar is an established community solar developer here in Minnesota. We have more than 100 projects around the state, which means that assuming this partnership continues to grow and this pilot works and we can continue convincing farmers this is a good idea for them and for us, we have projects all over the state that are close to wherever they're living. So now you're providing not only farmland access, but farmland access that's close to where they already are, so they don't have to necessarily relocate in order to farm. And that's kind of the goal. We got a lot of work to still go because starting a farm is hard, starting relationships is hard, but we're learning a lot together. Big River Farms has been an excellent partner in terms of brainstorming and solving problems with us. Where's a bathroom going? Most solar facilities don't necessarily have a bathroom, but it's pretty important when you're having people farming all the time. Or where's our storage shed going for our tools? Where's our cleaning facility going for when we're harvesting our vegetables and having to clean them to get them ready for market? Do we have refrigerated storage somewhere on site? All those farm questions that aren't necessarily natural for a solar development to think about. But, we're coming to the table in good faith. They're coming to the table in good faith. And we're really coming up with these innovative farm plans and relationships that we can hopefully repeat and scale around the state.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing to hear. And it's pretty innovative too, like just what you're talking about with your community solar projects and then having farmers work the land near where they live. Yeah, I've never actually heard that before. This is honestly, you're the first developer I've heard who's been able to do that. And obviously it sounds like it's because you have so many community solar projects, but also being flexible to the opportunity with agrivoltaics and seeing how there could be a partnership. I'm curious, what type of crops are actually popular to grow around the solar field?
Yeah, we have been intentionally not dictating to the farmers what they should or shouldn't grow. So it's been a little bit of trial and error. So this last year, anecdotally, I will shout out Julia Chamberlain, she was an intern for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and also was working as an agrivoltaics coordinator for US Solar. She did a lot of the hard research, so we'll be putting out some data shortly on yield amounts in different parts of the array and how that looks. But anecdotally, I'll share, at least in 2024 growing season, one of the big success stories was cilantro on our site. We had a really unusual winter here in Minnesota, the winter of 2023 to 2024, where we had almost no snow. We got really bad in the drought. And then it proceeded to rain for pretty much 2 months straight in the spring. And then it got really hot. So it created this not ideal growing solution for cilantro. Our control plot, our cilantro bolted very quickly. It got too hot. It was stressed the whole time. So we didn't get to harvest pretty much anything from our test plot for the cilantro. Underneath the solar array in that kind of semi-protected microclimate, we had a bumper crop. So we harvested a whole bunch of it and we could donate it to the food shelf down the road. So that did super well. Our tomatoes have been hit and miss in their first 2 seasons. This year they did really well. Last year, we struggled with them because our neighboring farmer was a potato farmer and sprayed. And then all of the potato beetles came over onto our tomatoes and killed a lot of that crop. So we're figuring out, like, not only is it the conditions on the site, but also what's around your site that can kind of impact some of that. But our two farmers, Stephen and Simon, planted a variety of crops. So they had some traditional, or what we consider more traditional crops, onions, beets, cucumbers, but they also planted some specialty African greens for their own market uses and for their own cultural uses. So I think we're going to see more research as we continue getting into growing season 2, 3, 4 moving forward. Again, we're excited now to have better water access on site. We also just at the end of this season moved some berries onto our site. So we'll also have some blueberry and raspberry production on the site moving forward. I don't have a great answer for what's the best thing to grow yet. We've seen some initial examples, but one growing season, I don't think is going to dictate everything, but just the sheer variety you can see, I think is really encouraging. And I know there's been some really interesting research, and some of it's been talked about on your podcast in the past about not only are you seeing different yield amounts, but are you going to see different flavor profiles in some of those crops depending on when they're getting sunlight and photosynthesizing that sunlight. Dr. Baron Gafford, has been working on some of this. He had some really interesting research that he shared at the World Agrivoltaics Summit this past summer in Colorado. And I'm really excited to see where the research goes, but just for the early gains of seeing such a variety that has succeeded under the array is really encouraging. And I'm so excited for these farmers to be able to get their operations growing and be successful.
Yeah, definitely. That's exciting. That's great work that you're doing. I know we talked about the World Agrivoltaics Summit on the pre-call or before the interview. Can you talk about what you learned from that conference? I just feel like there's a lot of innovation and everything's relatively new.
Yeah. The main takeaway that I got from it, I think, is that Europe, particularly in the United States, are approaching agrivoltaics pretty differently. The United States, I think, is looking at it a lot more heavily as energy production first, and then kind of the agrivoltaics crop elements are more of the secondary piece. I don't necessarily fault that. That's kind of how our systems are set up. Community solar is very much the system that is driving kilowatt hour production, megawatt hour production. In Europe, on the other hand, especially since they're a little bit more land constrained than the United States, they're focusing much more on crop yields first and the energy production second, which is where you're seeing a lot of those elevated modules that are spaced apart more to let more direct sunlight into the crops. A lot of that is, again, much more focused on maintaining the previous yield of those crops. Some of the laws, even in Germany, are requiring you to have at least 85% of the yield you did without the solar array there. So it's putting, again, a lot of focus on that, which is changing how they're designing the systems. So that was, I think, really interesting. The United States, I think the other one that I'm seeing is you're starting to finally get enough of a critical mass where you can take some experimentation risks. I was incredibly intrigued by one presentation that talked about cattle on solar arrays. And that's something US Solar is looking at as well. But the problem we've always thought about with cattle is everyone assumes two things. They're either going to rub on the posts and somehow damage the posts, or they're going to use their heads and damage the modules by hitting their heads on the modules. And there was one presentation that was challenging that idea and saying, well, what if we didn't elevate the modules? What if we did one of two things? What if we either just tabletopped our modules? We just told the modules that during the middle of the day, we're just going to leave them flat wherever the cattle are. That way you don't have to elevate the modules, but the cattle still should theoretically have plenty of space to wander underneath without hitting their heads. That's one idea. You lose a little bit of solar production, maybe, but that is probably pretty minor, especially if you're oversizing your array a little bit and clipping early on. So that's one approach. The other approach that we've thought about is, what if we're just not giving cows enough credit? If you present a cow with an option of saying, well, there's grass on both sides of this. On one of these sides, you have to duck your head into an awkward position to get at the grass. Or this other one, it's wide open. There's nothing in the way. You can just get to the grass. Why are we assuming that the cow is going to go for the harder one? And we could be wrong on this, but I'd be interested to see, what happens. What happens if you put cattle in a normal height array? I don't know that I've seen a good story other than an anecdotal thought experiment of what's going to happen in that scenario. In order to do that, you have to get your insurance team on board, your legal team on board, the farmer on board. There are a lot of hurdles there, but if you can unlock a way to allow cattle on a solar facility without having to change the design dramatically, if I have to elevate our array by a foot or two, we're talking about, tens of thousands of dollars of change per megawatt, which maybe it works, but if you're competing against a site that's not doing that, how's the math going to work there? But if we can suddenly say, well, we don't actually have to change the design a whole lot and we can still have this, now you're opening up millions of acres where it's grazing land right now to be both grazing and solar production. And now you've got a lot of wins lined up in a row. And that's what I thought was really fascinating at the World Agrivoltaics Summit. I mean, you see stuff from all over the world. It was cool to see, as a Minnesota boy, born and bred, I don't think about olive oil production or wine production in any serious way. So it was really interesting to hear what Italy was doing and France were doing on those pieces. But the main takeaways for me was just the very different approaches that Europe and the United States are taking, but also just a lot of excitement of new ideas as you're getting more minds focused on this issue.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. Like just getting groups of people together who are passionate about agrivoltaics and trying to make these projects work. Because that's how I felt. Obviously, there's been the U.S. Agrivoltaics Conference, and next year will be the third year of the conference. And it was just interesting because, first of all, how many people are attending these conferences? I think the first year, maybe there were 400 to 500 people for the first year of this conference, and just how creative everyone was being in the partnership. And it was not just solar developers. I was surprised how many farmers came across the country to basically give their ideas, or if they've been able to do it. Because I think the main challenge, and which I was going to ask you, is like, it seems like it's more expensive to develop it as a solar project. And how are you able to make the economics work?
That's a great question. And some of it does depend on how much do you have to change the array. For sheep grazing, it's really not much of a change. US Solar as a company policy has had, at a minimum, pollinator-friendly habitat on all of our projects so far. That might change as we get into, the desert Southwest, where it doesn't make sense to put in pollinator habitats. It's not native there. But in our initial markets of Minnesota and Illinois, these were prairie states, and bringing back prairie is easy and a good thing. As we're bringing in crop production, we're now trying to blend prairie a little bit. We still have prairie kind of on the outside with crops on the inside. But sheep, we're using them. It's actually very beneficial for us because pollinator habitat, prairie habitat is naturally fire regenerative. And we don't want that in a solar facility, understandably. So sheep are, pretty much tailor-made to come in and remove that thatch for us. Keep the soil healthy, churning up the soil with their hooves, pooping a little bit to get extra nutrients in the soil. So sheep are possibly the easiest thing to incorporate into solar facilities. I'm very thankful for them. Said big shout out from my side for Ken and Valley Grazers. Arlo Hark and Josie Tropel have been awesome to work with for us. Been growing their flock quite a bit, and Josie's now using the wool to make socks and hats and other products with us. It was awesome. I got to be part of a shearing day with them. It was great. But you come back to the question, for sheep, I don't have to do anything to the T array particularly. Maybe you change a single gate to make it a little bit easier for the livestock to come in and out. Maybe you add a spot for like a water trough, depending on how long the sheep are going to be on a site. But those are pretty minimal changes. So economically, very straightforward. Same with pollinator habitat. Yeah, the seed's a little bit more expensive at the beginning, but you have so many fewer maintenance visits long term. A lot of our sites are now in their 5th, 6th, 7th year of operation, and we're doing maybe a single visit a year, as opposed to if you're in turf grass, you're mowing every couple of months, every month, every couple of weeks if you're in, depending what part of the country you're in. So it can really save you money there. Crops is an interesting one for me because it's fewer acres you have to manage in a way, like the farmer's doing the management for you. It's a lot more coordination up front, and it's a lot of effort to find the partnerships. I will continue to praise Big River Farms forever because they've been as good of a partner as you could ever ask for, as accommodating of a partner as you could ever ask for. And I think that's going to go really well, but it takes a lot of time to have those meetings of figuring out, what does gate access look like? What does storage shed location look like? All those farm planning elements do take more time at the beginning. So there's maybe an overhead economic cost there. And, we are talking with Big River Farms because right now they're on a site that we retrofit for them. The site was already there and we brought farming on. But what does it look like if we're planning a site proactively? Do they want the site? Do they want the rows a little bit farther apart because there's some standard equipment that would be better to use if they had an extra foot? Are they okay with our height? Luckily in Minnesota, and because of our pollinator habitat, US Solar already has our low edge of our modules at a minimum of 36 inches because that's how tall our pollinator habitat gets. We also have a lot of snow in Minnesota, so we're naturally a touch higher than the rest of the country. But, is that acceptable? Do we need to elevate just a little bit? There's maybe a cost there. But that's so offset, in my opinion, in the benefits you get with the relationships and the communities you're in. I'm going to permitting meetings and I'm hearing concerns from those communities. They're saying, hey, this has been in agricultural production forever. You're going to change it. Tell me about that. If I can talk to them and say, well, yeah, it's going to change a little bit. It's going to look a little different, but we're still doing agriculture here. It's a lot easier and friendlier conversation than if I wanted to come in and say, hey, I'm going to put gravel everywhere, or I'm going to do a residential development. Like, that's a much harder conversation than me saying, hey, I'm going to bring in 20 new farmers to your community who are going to be shopping at your local stores and, filling up gas down the road and whatever else contributing to that community. Yeah, it's going to look different. There's going to be some solar above them, but we can also talk again. I know Dan French brought this up. Those farmers also now have some sun protection in the middle of the day, in the middle of the summer. It's a better experience for them from a shade perspective. For those sheep or those cattle, eventually, they have a better experience from a wellness perspective because they have a little bit of shade. So I think those benefits in terms of being able to come into communities and talk about what we're going to bring to them, not only in tax revenue and lease revenue, but also in supporting the agricultural community, that is worth every single coordination call and farm planning meeting that I ever have to have.
Yeah, that definitely makes things a lot easier when you're talking to a planning or permitting board. So yeah. I appreciate you for that. Obviously, you talked about Minnesota and it being not that incremental as far as cost if you do pollinators and raising. What states outside of like Minnesota or even Illinois are you looking to do agrivoltaics? Like, I guess, what are the ideal states that you have been developing or looking to develop?
Yeah. I mean, so the ideal states from an agrivoltaics perspective, I think, are kind of any of them. Like, you can find agriculture exists in every state in the country. It's just going to look a little different. I'm not going to try to put pollinator habitat in Arizona, for example. But I mean, Colorado, there's a lot of agriculture that happens there. It's different. We had a struggle with one of our Colorado sites that it had, water rights, a really big deal there. Once you have water rights, you don't want to lose them. They're very valuable. You're not going to get them back. So we had to come up with ideas of making sure whatever we were doing there was using the exact amount of water that they had for the water rights, which felt weird. Originally when we wanted to put in pollinator habitat as a starting point, and the results came back and said, actually, that's not going to use enough water. You got to find something different. We're like, well, we don't want to waste water. Like, water is a precious resource. We want to make sure it's being used productively. So we're looking at, okay, well, let's look at which crops we can put in at least. So at least if we're using this water, we're getting this crop still out of it. So that's been an interesting use. New York, we're looking at, New York put out its own support program looking at agrivoltaics, particularly focusing on cattle. So we're applying some state program money out there to cattle voltaics. I think cattle has been a huge opportunity in a lot of the markets we looked at. If you get into Oklahoma, Texas, anywhere in kind of states with a lot of Bureau of Land Management land, there's a lot of ranching land. I think there's a lot of agrivoltaic elements that are really well suited there. From our perspective, again, it's just where can I build a solar facility where it has access to either a program to support it or to markets where we can sell it into. Just because sun falls somewhere on the ground and you could capture it theoretically with solar panel doesn't mean I have anywhere to sell that power. So for us, we're in Minnesota, Illinois, Colorado, New Mexico, New York, Maine, Connecticut, because those have established community solar programs that allow us to function at that size. Transmission scale is a little different because you have more organized markets. The West is starting to figure itself out between, either SPP plus, SPP going come to the West, or California's day-ahead market, expanded day-ahead market, or their pathways projects. So the West is getting itself organized in a way that they haven't previously, which is going to make things a lot easier, and there's going to be more opportunities for solar to happen in the West. But in terms of ideal sites, to your original question, I know I tend to dance around a little bit. We're following policy everywhere.
Which most developers are, and it's challenging too, right? Because sometimes policies aren't clear. A lot of developers were aggressively going into the California market, thinking about the 7 gigawatt potential solar legislation that ended up not going forward by the California PUC. It's interesting to hear your perspective, just because I think every developer is looking at all the different markets and then just trying to figure out what's best for them. And as you know too, Peter, like, markets get saturated pretty quickly, which happened in Minnesota as well. Can you talk about like how are things in the Minnesota market? I know like they were also trying to prioritize not just land-based community solar. They were trying to also do like more rooftops. What's happening right now with the Minnesota solar market? I know there was a lot of development, happening, especially with the community. So
happy to talk about that. Before I forget, I'm going to do a quick shout out to CCSA, the community or the Coalition of Community Solar Access, particularly because they just for the first time started talking about agrivoltaics in their state policy advocacy work. So we can come back around to that. But the Minnesota market, again, near and dear to my heart. Minnesota was for many years after the creation of our program, the leading community solar state in the country. We've now been passed by New York, largely because New York had larger projects. Minnesota for many years only allowed 1 megawatt projects at a time, which didn't see a lot of national, bigger developer interest. It was perfect for us. We got really, really good at making 1 megawatt projects. But Minnesota had an advantage that many states didn't have for many years. And it's because that our program was designed to not have a cap, to not have an RFP process. How it worked was if you got your interconnection agreement and you had your local permit and you had your subscribers and you had your financing, you could build. It was great. The struggle for that was, again, the 1 megawatt size wasn't everyone's favorite. It was workable. But the other piece was your subscribers for community solar, your customers, your off-takers, had to either be in the same county or an adjacent county to your project, the so-called adjacency rule. And what this did is, Minnesota, there are a few other population centers, but mainly it's the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul and kind of surrounding suburbs. So knowing that that's kind of where the load was, particularly this program was just for Xcel Energy, which is our biggest utility. It's not our only one, but it's our biggest one. But it put a lot of pressure just in the ring right around Minneapolis and St. Paul, right on that kind of urban-rural divide. So you're adding in a new pressure where there already was an existing one. There's already this kind of this tension between farmers who were seeing expansion of suburbs and exurbs outward, plus folks who were moving out there because they wanted to have this rural agrarian vista. And then we were putting a bunch of solar facilities in there as well. I think part of the reason that Minnesota had a lot of early success with pollinator habitat as well, I mean, Minnesota has the most pollinator-friendly solar facilities in the country pretty comfortably, was because you were trying to meet that. But over the years, unfortunately, you started tapping out all of those substations that are in that ring. There was only so many substations you can go to. So it started to kind of stagnate here in Minnesota for a little bit. And thankfully, surprisingly, we ended up with a DFL, a Democratic trifecta here a few years ago. And it allowed us to finally kind of address our community solar program's challenges for the first time in many years. So the change that ended up happening was we now do have a cap. So there is going to be a selection process. That uncapped element is going away. But in exchange, the projects are getting bigger. They're also creating kind of a secondary program outside of community solar to bring more solar to the other utilities in the state as well. And as part of all of this, there's a focus on supporting community solar in low-income communities or supporting subscribers from low-income communities, which has been a really big deal and very important. And to your point, there are different selection criterias that can get you better likelihood of getting an award, whether that's on rooftops or using agrivoltaics, for example. So there are these elements that are trying to support better project design and location to give these maximum benefits. But those program rules are just rolling out. We're just going into we just had our first selection year. And again, you're seeing a pretty big shift now from 1 megawatt to 5 megawatt projects. And even this other program allows up to 10 megawatt projects, which will also be interesting. But I think it's going to fostering a lot more investment in Minnesota's community solar space and solar space in general than we've seen over the last couple of years. And I'm excited to see Minnesota hopefully catch up to New York or continue our strong stance here in the country as a community solar capital, we'll say.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to hear about that. We're a developer as well and have developed a lot of community solar in New York. And it's great to hear about what Minnesota is doing and incorporating, some of these important concepts, agrivoltaics, LMI, obviously discounts for community solar, prioritizing rooftop. That's exciting to hear. And, I appreciate obviously all the work that you've done in US Solar, and specifically for you, 8 years doing this, and especially in Minnesota. I know you mentioned that Worldwide Agrivoltaics Conference. I know you mentioned you're going to probably be attending that as well in Germany in July. And then will you be also attending the North America's Agrivoltaics Expo on August 4th to 7th? That's interesting enough. Peter looks so familiar to me. It's because I saw him at the first year of this conference that's organized by Dan French. And it's a great gathering of people within the U.S. solar industry to bring back agrivoltaics. And congrats on getting a picture with Dennis Rodman. I know he was pretty selective on the pictures. We were talking about this before. Actually, my job is to get him as the keynote speaker, hopefully, for the upcoming conference. And we're trying to raise money to sponsor him to come as a speaker. So if anyone's interested, actually, Dennis had a great conversation with I and Dan French about he was interested in agrivoltaics because he actually has a farm in Texas, and where we happened to have the conference the first year is actually the hotel he stays at when he's in Chicago. And he was at a shoe conference or something at that time. It's interesting because when we were telling him about it, he was really excited about it. And I think you've experienced that a lot, like just trying to educate, right, farmers who are not familiar with this. This is still relatively new. And I know we talked about this too, Peter. It's like, your dad came from a farming background, your wife's family is into farming. Like, I think that's huge to be able to communicate, because you can have a better perspective of, especially as a developer project, right? To educate them on opportunity. I think the challenge is to educate them. And obviously, like, being a part of this podcast and other podcasts, I know you're on that farming podcast recently, is a way of like basically educating the community that there's an opportunity out there that they might not be familiar with. And it creates economic opportunity, it diversifies their income sources. Can you talk about like the challenge of like the education aspect and getting the word out?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, just to quickly answer your question, I will absolutely be with Dan French at the Solar Farm Summit, or the now renamed North American, help me out here.
Oh, sure. And it's August 4th to 7th, 2025 in Chicago, Illinois, which is a beautiful time.
Yeah, I still have it as the Solar Farm Summit in my head from the first year. We were actually lucky enough to receive the Solar Farm of the Year award with our Bigger Farms. So very excited there. But coming around to your other question here about education, this has been an exciting part in our relationship with Bigger Farms as well, because just because they have farmers doesn't mean that every single one of their farmers wants to go be on a solar facility either. You have to kind of imagine what it looks like. And that's what's been really important about our Bigger Farms Big Lake partnership at the Big Lake project, is that it's so much easier to get people on board with agrivoltaics and understand the opportunity of agrivoltaics if you can have them stand on a site. Jack's Solar Garden in Colorado does the same thing, where you're giving tours and helping people experience what it feels like, because it's not maybe the most intuitive thing to say, hey, there is opportunity to grow crops underneath the solar array. I think a lot of people would say, well, if it's under a solar array, like, how is there any room? It's going to be shaded. There's all these assumptions of the negative. Whereas if you can stand on the site and see the crops planted and see how the sun is moving throughout an event, that gives you more hope and understanding of the opportunity. So Bigger Farms, for example, has been hosting a lot of informational events just for farmers. I'll show up as a solar representative just so they can answer questions about the facility and kind of give some overviews. But really, it's focused on farmers talking to farmers and kind of expanding the word that way. That's been great. And then this last September, we hosted what we called our Sunshine Harvest dinner event. This is building on an event that Rob Davis did for many years with Connexus, but we invited policymakers and landowners and politicians and our own staff and community members and media to our site. And we gave them tours, and we provided food that was from the site or from solar facilities for the event. So we had, lamb from Cannon Valley Grazers, that had been grazing on solar facilities. My favorite is we also keep bees on that site. So we had honey, and one of our subscribers for that community solar garden is a brewery right down the road called Lupulin Brewing. And we gave them honey, and they created a solar grown beer. It was a Bach beer with honey in it. It was called Dark Side of the Sun. It may have had some similarities in can design to a specific album cover you can imagine. And, we had this great evening of speakers and conversation. We had the Emerging Farmers Office from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture speak and talk about their work. We had, our farmers come up and speak. We had Bigger Farms speak. We even had messages come in from Senator Tina Smith and Senator Amy Klobuchar, our Minnesota senators. It was a great evening. Again, just bringing awareness to this topic, bringing support to this topic, and just getting more people to know what it is. My wife works in politics now. She's actually about to join the Minnesota House of Representatives. And she's talked with her colleagues a little bit. We share passions. She came from the energy and climate space as well. She worked in energy efficiency before this. I work in solar. And she's gotten to talk a little bit about my work. And she's gotten a really good positive response there, especially because there's already some champions. Patty Acom is an awesome champion of agrivoltaics here in Minnesota, but there's still a lot of people that have never heard of this term. And having more of these events where I can bring folks to that site, stand on the soil, see it, maybe even do a little volunteer day. We've done some internal volunteer days with our employees to go weed for a day or go harvest for a day. Giving those touch points, giving that investment in that understanding of why we're doing this has been really helpful. I'm excited to bring more folks out in 2025 to the site and get them excited about agrivoltaics.
Yeah, definitely. This has been an amazing interview, Peter. I really appreciate your time today. If people wanted to learn more about you and US Solar, what's the best way they could do that?
Yeah, our website is www.us-solar.com. We even have an agrivoltaics page as well as our sustainability report, so you can kind of see where we've been investing our time and the work we've been doing in agrivoltaics. And we're happy to talk to anyone and everybody about getting into solar, getting into community solar, getting into agrivoltaics. So happy to hear from you.
That sounds great. And we'll have that in the notes of the podcast as well. We'll also have the 2 conferences on agrivoltaics that we were talking about as well. And thank you again, Peter. Keep up the great work. I'm excited I think agrivoltaics is going to, obviously continue to grow and grow exponentially, and excited to talk more about that in the future.
Thanks so much, Benoy. Really appreciate it.
Oh, anytime. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.